Hi, friends. Welcome to Bar of the Conference. I'm your host, Derek Scott III. I'm excited to share this interview with you. I got to sit down with Randall Miller. Randall is an incredible leader, thought leader at that, strategist, activist, and he has been involved in the United Methodist Church for decades. He has served at multiple levels of the church, multiple boards and commissions and committees. And of many things that's remarkable about Randall, it's the fact that he is an out gay African American man that has so much history with our church. And that's why I wanted to sit down with him. I wanted to get an understanding the history of LGBTQ resistance and the work that has been done over the decades in the United Methodist Church towards inclusion of queer folk in the life of our church. And so we did. He gave me some time, and like many of these interviews, it was 2 hours of just incredible content. In fact, y'all, it was so good, I couldn't find a place to edit. I couldn't figure out what not to include. So I just decided that just going to make this a two-parter. So I'm not going to spend much more time in this introduction. We'll just go right into it. Grab a notebook, choice beverage, and get ready. Like, this really helped me understand how we got to this particular place in the life of the United Methodist Church. So without further ado, I present to you part one of my interview with Randall Miller. Enjoy. Randall Miller, how you doing today?
I am doing really well, especially because it's getting near the end of the working day. So this is my special time.
Well, I hope to not take too much of your time, but I really appreciate you being willing to jump in on Bar of the Conference. I really just personally appreciate so much of what you bring to the United Methodist Church, your leadership. I mean, I think in many, many ways, I want to be Randall Miller when I grow up.
Oh,
And there's some obvious things. And then there's some other things that's like, no, really, like there's just a competence that you bring that I'm deeply appreciative of and I admire, and so doubly grateful that you're willing to join me on this podcast and have a bit of a conversation. How long have you been a part of the United Methodist Church?
since I was 16. So let's see, where am I now? So almost 45 years.
Okay,
45 years.
that is and we're not going to take the road trip through the entire 45 years, but my sense is, and this is the particular reason I wanted to have a conversation with you, is that you have been engaged in many aspects of the church, as a layperson, as a leader, but also and also in resistance of racism and white supremacy across many years, but also as a gay man. And that's what I'd love for us to talk about in this conversation. So, because I think a lot of us have come to this moment in the United Methodist Church, and as it is with all of us, we just think that the issues that we're facing are these brand new issues, and we're the only ones who've ever been thinking about them, pushing back against them. And so we just don't have a huge sense, or a clear sense rather, of where we fall in the history.
Mm-hmm.
And whose shoulders we are standing on top of, who's done a lot of the hard work. And I can name, I came out as a gay man 2.5 years ago, and I knew that by doing that, that could affect my roles in the United Methodist Church, from my local church all the way to general church. And I can honestly say I didn't lose as much when I came out. But I'm clear that the reason why is because of probably hundreds of people in the United Methodist Church who came out and who lost much. and blazed that trail with tears and pain, so that me coming out was more affirmative than destructive to my being. And so I again, this is where my appreciation for you just goes through the roof. But I thought it would be good if we got a bit of a history of LGBTQ plus resistance,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding the story that gets us to this particular moment
Right.
in United Methodism. So I've got my notebook. I'm here to learn, and you can kind of take us in what direction and whatever you want. And like I'll probably drop in and like ask a question or double click on something that I think is really interesting that we want to amplify. But tell us where to start. Like when we start thinking about LGBTQ queer inclusion in the United Methodist Church, what is our history and where do we want to start that conversation?
Yeah, and I think the real focused history. So obviously, there have been LGBTQ plus people in the history of the United Methodist Church throughout, and for most of that history, those individuals were closeted, or there was no words to describe the identity and sexual orientation or gender identity that they held within themselves. But throughout the history, there have been what we would now call queer folk in the United Methodist Church and in its predecessor bodies. So that's pretty clear from sort of looking at the history. The real focused advocacy, though, around the United Methodist Church probably dates back from the early 70s, late 60s. And way before my time, by the way. So I don't include myself in the earliest layer of this history.
Noted. It is noted, yes.
And in fact, by the time I came along, well, let me tell the story in order. So there was a group of clergy, of folks who aspired to be clergy or who were clergy, who in the 1970s began to be sort of expelled or having their ordination credentials taken, or didn't make it through the ordination process. And they could have, this is way back in the early 70s, they could have gone away, they could have slunk off, but instead they started this history of protest at their annual conferences and at their general conferences. And so that earliest core group of folks were these clergy or aspiring to be clergy who were just denied their calling. And as you said, that denial of calling was a source of deep pain for all of them, because I didn't meet all of them. I've heard the stories, but I've met some. And really, their vocation was to serve as clergy in local churches. They didn't have another sense of vocation. And so the church denying that calling, while in some cases saying, well, you certainly have the gifts to be a pastor if only you weren't gay or lesbian at that time, we would certainly welcome you into the United Methodist Church, or hinting at a kind of don't ask, don't tell. Just don't be public about that and sort of live a closeted life and you'll be okay. And it was the 70s where the queer revolution, LGBTQ plus revolution was taking off. And to their credit, that small group of activists refused to do that, refused to slink away. And for years, protested in outside annual conference and general conference. And that really began, I think, what was the open resistance phase of what we call now the reconciling movement. There was hope that the hearts and minds of United Methodists would change, and therefore change the anti-LGBT policies that were in the Book of Discipline and the anti-LGBT practices. But it felt like it was a very, very long way off. And so And again, I'll say, instead of going away, they practiced the art of resistance and made themselves publicly visible, doing protest in their annual conferences, wearing their collars, and protesting at general conference, knowing full well the reception they would meet there, which was either kind of derision aimed at them, or even worse, that polite ignoring of people that church people do when they want to ice out other people. So, which is really difficult. So that was really the start, and added to these layer of clergy people, there were one or two really brave bishops, and probably who were supporting and beginning to speak out around the harm that the incompatible language did to gay and lesbian persons at that point. And they were Bishop Mel Wheatley, and then you can see his face, Bishop Calvin McConnell. And both of those two bishops and their wives were really, really active early on, and faced the stigma and the shaming and the complaints that were filed against them for being fairly outspoken supporters of LGBT inclusion back in the early 70s. From that period of that sort of those early clergy, Affirmation was kind of launched, and Affirmation was and is the unofficial queer caucus of the United Methodist Church. And at the point it was launched in the United Methodist Church, that was the only organizing body that was led by LGBTQ folks, and had a strong principle around self-determination, and challenging the church to change its policies. So it was still in the nature of resistance. Again, people didn't really believe that the church would change, but they hoped it would. And some people who joined Affirmation, there was both the national group, which had one or two annual meetings each year, and then there were about 13 different local Affirmation chapters around the country. And all of those were really thriving in the 70s and early 80s, and practicing forms of resistance and embracing civil disobedience practices to peacefully disrupt the business of the church. And so that's also when the first kind of protests, but really they were polite, quiet, walking onto the floor of general conference, and with signs and singing and praying for LGBT inclusion, and letting the church know that they needed to change. That's when those protests first started. And again, the composition of the general conference was very different than now. There were conservatives who weren't as well organized. There were actually centrist and moderates who didn't know what to think about these issues. And then there were LGBTQ plus and our allies, which was the smallest of the groups at General Conference. So that really, for about a decade or more, that phase of resistance was really, I have to say it was thrilling, because we really practiced church and lived our values. It's not that we didn't disagree with each other about which way liberation was headed, and there we always had people who were focused on sort of practical outcomes, and people who were more focused on sort of queer liberation, meaning changing the culture. We had people who identified more as Christians then. We had people, particularly women, who had been rejected by the church, who had embraced some forms of paganism as well, but were still in the broad fellowship of Affirmation. And so it really was a very powerful time of organizing mostly outside the church and witnessing to the church about the need for greater inclusion.
Wow. Randall, this thank you for this. There's so many questions I've got. I do want to zero in on this particular piece. What year did the incompatibility language get added to the Book of Discipline?
1972.
Yeah.
So, yeah, 4 years after the Unification Conference.
And I wonder, and this is speculative at best, probably, but was the forming of affirmation and the beginning of the organizing, was that in response to the language being added? And or you mentioned a bit ago the ways that even the church would sort of ignore and distance themselves from individuals. And I'd love for you to respond to that, because I think there's a mindset that says, well, people got upset when things changed in the Book of Discipline. And I wonder if it was much more like basic and like human and just like emotional. Like, no, people felt excluded at a very basic level of church life.
Yes.
And it required a response. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, I think people mistake that the putting of the language in the discipline was actually kind of the start of the homophobia writ large, and it was not. So in various annual conferences, even the ones that we think of as being very progressive now, there was nobody who was getting ordained who was out or about whom there were rumors about their sexuality, or boards of ordination would notice that you weren't married. And so all of these were sort of like red flags. I know when I was in the ordination process a decade later, it's still the fact that I was not married at age 22 was a red flag. It's like, really? At age 22? I've got to be married? But no, I think it was a response to what was happening in the church at the local annual conference and general conference level. And then the other thing that people don't remember or forget is that actually the language going into the first language that turned into the incompatibility clause was affirming language about different kinds of sexuality. So when the social principles were rewritten, that paragraph was written as an affirming statement about human sexuality. And it did not call out lesbian and gay people. It just said human sexuality is a gift from God, is a sacred gift from God. It did not say all that other stuff. And it was on the floor of General Conference that basic affirmation, which was written to be sex positive, for lack of a better, they knew what they were doing. They were not. So it was on the floor of General Conference where someone raised the question, what does this mean about gay and lesbian people? And that's where the incompatibility thing came from. It did not come from the committee that had revised the social principles. So, wow. So that was the start of the open conflict at the general church level around human sexuality. And I happened to be there as a youth delegate, and General Conference was very different then. It was primarily men, primarily white men, even though there was diversity creeping in. It just was a very different place. So, it just turned out they were unwilling to embrace this sort of very positive, generally positive statement about human sexuality that was meant to be adopted. So again, it wasn't that homophobia started there. The homophobia got codified there. But it didn't start. It was already happening, and people were already denied ordination. So, and again, the affirmation chapters were flourishing at that point. You know, LGBTQ people were finding each other in the context of the Methodist Church. And there were some huge chapters, and the largest ones were actually in like the Southeast and South Central. So there were large ones in the Northeast as well, and certainly in the West. But the largest chapter of affirmation was the one based in Dallas, Texas. And it was almost in a way evangelical as well, but they happened to be mostly gay men. So I have to say that there were very few people of color involved in affirmation at that time. So when I went to my first meeting in the early 80s, national meeting in the early 80s, I was the only Black person there. And I remember trying to decide if I wanted to go to this gathering. It was in Washington, D.C., and I circled the building 3 times in my rental car. And then finally I said, okay, I'm going to go to this. And I walked in. I was like, there are only white people here. Like, wow. I'm in the promised land. And lo and behold, there are only white people here. And I think my good friends, people who became my good friends, Mary Gaddis, who is legendary in the movement, and Judy Cayo, sort of recognized what was happening and made it their business to like make me their kind of third partner for the weekends. It sort of like introduce me around, take me around, sort of coach me about sort of the coming out process. And so, but it is true that affirmation itself had a lot of problems attracting and maintaining people of color. Part of it was the number of people of color who were out and willing to be out in the context of the United Methodist Church, which is relatively few. And then those who were out, you know, they're like, why would I bother being half in and half out of the United Methodist Church? I'm going to go to someplace else. So in those days, it felt like we had 2 competing strategies. One was that if you had been harmed enough, I don't think they were competing, interlinked strategies. If you had been harmed enough and traumatized by the United Methodist Church, we were going to help you get out. And I actually preached a sermon during that time where I compared it to the Underground Railroad. So if you have been harmed and what you need is freedom and liberation in your life, and the United Methodist Church cannot, will not, in your opinion, in the foreseeable future provide that for you, you should find another spiritual home that will give you what you need and not feel like it was an abusive relationship. And there were many people wounded who really needed to hear that kind of liberating thing about stay connected to us, but find another spiritual home, one that you don't. And then the other strategy was we have no choice. We don't think we have the numbers to change any policies in the United Methodist Church. And actually what was happening was the anti-LGBTQ plus policies were proliferating. So we started with the incompatibility clause, and then came the restrictions on ordination, and then came this, and then, you know, over the next kind of 10 or 12 years, they actually proliferated until they are what they are now. And so, those of us who want to witness to the United Methodist Church about our own liberation and the power of being open and queer, hang out. We are going to do training around civil disobedience, where we don't other these people who seem to hate us, but do a prayerful, gentle witness about that. So we're going to use civil disobedience. We're not going to engage in any physical fight. We're not going to yell back at people. We're going to offer a peaceful witness to who we are. And and hope to change hearts and minds in the church. So that, and for a long time, I would have said I was so deeply immersed in that, and it was such a rich, informative time in the local churches that were beginning to be inclusive, and in affirmation, that I kind of felt like I could stay in that world forever. Like I could go to the general conference and protest and give witness, but really the world that I lived in was this kind of affirming world where LGBTQ plus people were doing it for ourselves in terms of prescribing our liberation. We were writing, liturgies, and there was a Beth Richardson, who I don't know if you know, and Mark Bow, had started this journal called Manna for the Journey, and it was just incredible because we had all of these like pent up theologians and would be pastors, and they couldn't serve local churches for the most part, although some folks were closeted in local churches, just kind of writing and thinking about what all this meant and putting it into this journal that would come out quarterly or something like that. And so in some ways, it was a very difficult time in terms of the relationship in the church. And in another way, it was very formative and very rich as we created sort of this parallel community that intersected the church, but was not determined or controlled by the church. It was probably one of the most formative things that I experienced in terms of liberation and connecting with other queer folks in a spiritual affirmative space. And again, it was not that we did not have our difficulties and divides and things like that. But affirmation did everything by consensus, which, so that meant our meetings were like 10 hours long.
Wow.
Consensus, right?
My gosh. I mean, I just cannot imagine. I can't imagine, but I can't imagine.
It was, everyone was trained in consensus and we had facilitators, but it took a long time to come to any kind of key decisions. So, but it was still a very rich and formative time. And then at the same time, Mark Bowman, in 1982, I think, but or 1986, because I was kind of fully there, started the reconciling movement, and which were these churches that were ready to declare themselves welcoming places for LGBTQ plus people. So I'm skipping over that there were debates about every time we expanded the types of people that were in the family or the coalition, there were debates about that. So I also don't want to cover over that. And particularly, we had a long debate about trans inclusion, which I know will be hurtful to hear about to some of the folks, and about bisexual folks. And to me, it seemed very clear from the beginning. It's like, look, if you are bisexual, okay, I believe you, and you're part of this movement because this is a movement of resistance against. And then for trans people, it's like, yeah, and this is not this is not even a question for me. Trans people need to be a part of the movement too, because we're an open, welcoming, inclusive movement. And we used to use the term sort of sexual and gender minorities then, and they were like in the tribe. And so it's like, it's not that we understand everything about what's going on with bi and trans people back then, but we certainly could learn, and the best way to learn is to like bring them in to talk about their own lives, the same way that we have gay and lesbian folks have been talking about our lives in this organization and learning from each other for 15 years. We most certainly hear the bi and trans perspective, but that was not shared by everyone, and it took us a couple of years to work ourselves to that sort of conclusions about being that we, of all people, needed to be open and welcoming. So
I think that's so important to name, Randall. I think sometimes I can speak for myself. I often, on my journey of affirming queer identities, I often would see my friends and colleagues who were very strong in their advocacy. And my assumption was that they had sort of arrived to this place, and I just wasn't there yet. And what I've learned is that we're all on our journeys
Yeah.
of understanding each other and holding space for each other,
Yes.
and being okay with not having every single answer about a person's life to say you are a child of God and person of worth.
Yes.
And yes, you are called to the life of the church, and we should make room for you. Like, you didn't need to have all the answers to affirm that.
No.
But it was an eye-opening experience when I was, happened to be in a room full of gay men who weren't completely sure about bisexuals,
Yeah.
and weren't ready to include trans folk in the conversation. And then, we continue to learn, right? And so we've added to the letters, and we've added to, we've increased the circle of who's welcome in this space.
Yes.
When we talk about queerness. So I appreciate you naming that.
Yeah, and part of it is doing your own your own inner work. So if the issue with trans folks is that you have not dealt with your own femininity or the parts of you that are female identified, do that work. If that's why really at the core why you're not sort of interacting and partnering and friending trans folks, then do that work. Because that can't be the reason that people are kept out of community because you haven't done the work. And we all need to do that work. If you imagine that gayness is a rigid identity and therefore you can't have bisexual folks because they challenge the rigid boundaries of what you do the work. Gayness is not a rigid identity. There are lots of varieties and forms of gaiety. And so we can reach out and embrace and understand all of the varieties of bisexuality as well. So I think it's really important for people to, including myself, because I had to do my work, to really kind of work through that and say, oh, yeah, I right there with you. So, but it was a journey. It was not that overnight we all decided, oh yes, we're going to be this inclusive. So, but so the next phase probably of the work of the struggle within the United Methodist Church was that affirmation, which was this sort of self-determined space of mostly gay men and lesbians sort of coming together in local chapters. It started to not work anymore. And I think it stopped working because more and more, particularly cities, started having more open possibilities for queer folk to do things. And so you weren't just confined to affirmation if you were living in Dallas or Washington, D.C. And there was competition, for people's participation. And some people couldn't put up with the church stuff anymore, and they kind of drifted off. So affirmation began to decline, and each of its local chapters began to decline pretty rapidly in the mid 80s. And I should say that part of it was the HIV pandemic. So a lot of folks, especially gay men, who were active participants in affirmation passed away from HIV/AIDS during the height of the crisis. And it was also, in many cases, what propelled local churches to become reconciling, because before they knew what had hit them, they had people that they loved in their congregations who were now very ill with HIV and AIDS. And in many congregations, women organized to take care of those people because all they knew was that they loved these men who were in their congregations and in their communities, and they organized. And then from that, it's not hard to extrapolate to, well, why then wouldn't we be fully embracing LGBT people, regardless, whether they were living with HIV or sick or whatever. And so they became sort of the bedrock of creating these reconciling churches. And it was slow at first, but it in many ways, looking back, the reconciling movement and reconciling churches really took off during that era. And as affirmation declined and more churches became hospitable places, it hastened the decline of affirmation. The reconciling churches became the focus of the movement and the place where gay and lesbian people, but also bisexual and transgender, that became the place where they were at home rather than affirmation. And so rather than being outside of the church, they were now inside a local United Methodist church that we were now inside a local United Methodist church that had embraced us. And that created this, at first, the reconciling movement, it was strangely apolitical and didn't really focus on, for example, changing the policies of the General Conference. That effort was actually led by MFSA for a long, long time. And what the reconciling church program did, RCP at that point, was to host a what do you call it? A hospitality suite at the conference where people could come and pick up resources and gather stuff, and then the witness could be organized. But it wasn't explicitly, in those days, our reconciling congregation program wasn't explicitly trying to change the policies of the General Conference. That was really kind of affirmation, but especially MFSA at that point. And we began to shift from the witness, which we still do today, but just doing the protesting and the witnessing and the handing out of literature and resources, to explicitly trying to change votes at the General Conference. And so there were these two prongs that not always got along with each other, but and some people felt like they could not be doing the kind of policy work because they weren't that far out and couldn't be on camera. But and so that's when the two prongs, this was now in the early 90s, where those two things began to shape up, and they're still around. We still do the witness, and we still do the changing of policies and the Book of Discipline. And there are still people who do one and don't do the other. And I don't know, I actually believe in both, but I think my nature was to I think it's time to get up and kind of change some of the policies. So in the 90s, I think I spoke to the General Conference 3 times in talking to them, once from the floor when I was co-leading the protest, and then twice from the podium where I was asked to speak on the importance of LGBT civil rights. So the strange, confusing, conflicting thing is, even though the United Methodist Church has had since 1972 the incompatibility clause, homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, it has also affirmed the civil rights of gay and lesbian people. So it was this strange kind of parallel where the church seemed for a long time absolutely clear on supporting the civil rights of gay and lesbian people. That's what the language said. It did not have the whole alphabet, but also opposed and didn't see how having the one statement, the incompatibility statement, erodes the second. So some of our work was to show that the one erodes the second, that when I spoke to the General Conference about the importance of gay and lesbian civil rights. And we were doing that because we went to a city that opposed gay and lesbian civil rights. And so to counteract that, they asked a Black gay man to come and speak about, on the floor of the conference.
That's one way to do it. Okay.
And I just said to them, we very much appreciate that the church supports the civil rights of gay and lesbian people, but you must know that treating us as second-class citizens in the United Methodist Church itself provides the exact opposite witness, and in fact undermines the strong stance in terms of that you can't have a house that's built on both things. And so you've got to move towards embracing the other. So and so I probably the bulk of our energy then in the 90s and the 2000s was spent sort of fighting the good fight around changing the policies. We had very little success, to be honest, but and so it was very, very difficult because the by then good news had become more powerful than it once was, and was beginning to control blocks of delegates, which at that time point, we didn't control any delegates. We didn't even have any. We didn't track delegates. We didn't reach out to see who would be voting for us. We didn't have any of that going on at that point. And the good news was not only sort of at that point better organized than we were in terms of controlling delegates, because they had, let's call it the societal consensus about sort of that LGBTQ plus people were not equal citizens going for them. But they did it in the meanest ways possible. So that it was not only that they were winning these votes, but they were rubbing our faces in that they were winning the votes and treating us as if for a long time, they would not use the word gay or lesbian. They would just keep repeating homosexual, knowing full well that what the preference around what people wanted to be called. And it was a way of dehumanizing us. They would never refer to us as fellow Christians. It was always homosexual advocates, not the person who went to so-and-so United Methodist Church down the street. With the implication that we were outside kind of agitators, that we're not, we weren't members of the church. It's like, no, we grew up here. Mm-hmm. Nobody is coming to this mess who is like an adult, openly gay, lesbian person. They're not coming to this church and coming into this mess because it's too messy. So the only people around here are people who grew up in this church and who, took the same vows of membership that y'all did, who have been contributing tithes, who are members of local churches. That's really who we are. And for a long time, they put a lot of energy into sort of painting us as outside agitators and strange. And, we were a little hippie-ish collectively. And so it did feel like throughout the 90s and early 2000s, it was kind of a beating. And if there had been, I remember when Karen Danham, her trial happened and what happened there, there was a strong negative reaction in the General Conference. And it was like they put all the anti-LGBT legislation on one day on the plenary floor. And it just felt like an all-day beating, where we would get up and rally our delegates, and maybe we had a fourth of the delegates voting with us, or a third, but they had 2/3 of the delegates, and we would lose time after time again, and they would, it did feel like they were kind of rubbing our faces in it and sort of doing the legislation in the harshest way possible. So it did not feel like, oh, we're principled people and we're principled people, but we just don't support LGBT equality. It felt really nasty and personal, and as if they were trying to deliver a knockout punch to our side of the equation.
I'm almost imagining myself in the room on a day full of anti-LGBTQ legislation.
Yeah.
And just the weight of all of that. Can you remind us, is it Karen?
During that time, we actually tried our best to not have things happen right before General Conference that would trigger like moderates at General Conference. We knew the conservatives were against us, but our thought was, because we had seen it, that the conservative moderate bloc voting against repealing stuff or would grow if people saw something like a clergy trial where the person got off. And I think what happened was it was in the West, and Karen got off. She went through the trial, and they gave her like an assignment to complete as her punishment, if you will. Right, and the assignment was, I think, sort of writing about what it meant to be an open lesbian in the United Methodist Church and the theological issues around that. And so, which in those days would have been interpreted by moderates and conservatives alike as sort of a show trial and sort of not abiding by the rules of the Book of Discipline. And what it resulted in, and I want to be clear, I'm not blaming Karen or the folks who supported her through that trial process, because she, it happened when it happened. The Spirit called her to resist and tell people who she was and not hide. And she chose to face the consequences of that. And it was a big sort of high profile clergy trial of the sort we haven't had for a while. And it did make the reaction at the General Conference, the conservative moderate bloc of people voting for sort of to hold the line on anti-gay stuff did grow bigger. And they also were able to organize, and they said it was, so we wouldn't disturb the rest of the General Conference, but they were also able to organize all of the legislation on one day, all of the anti-LGBTQ legislation on one day. I think it was like 7 or 8 pieces. Wow. And so, which is, in a plenary, that's like an all day. So you have to organize to fight each piece of legislation one after the other, because that's why you're there. And it's like climbing up a hill when after the first 1 or 2, you're not going to win. But on the other hand, you have to make a principled witness that you're not okay with what is happening, and hopefully try and shame a few people who are going along with this, that, whatever you think you're doing, this is impossibly cruel, to like 7 times kind of reiterate that people are not fully included in the United Methodist Church, and to just keep going and allow it to happen. It was just, and that was probably one of the more intense times, but other General Conferences were like that in terms of just the oomph that it took to show up, to battle against it, and then to be outmaneuvered. And I will say then have the people who outmaneuvered you celebrate Christ's great victory at the United Methodist General Conference. Now, Christ has nothing to do with the shenanigans that you all pulled on the floor of General Conference. So you could say Christ did it. And that was really the history for about 10 or 12 years until, and I would say up until 2019, actually, that we were kind of in a stalemate, that we couldn't repeal anything. And it felt like the other side had gotten everything that they wanted, and we were just in this kind of détente, right? That's what we were. And then from that view of history, 2019 was really the first time in a while that there was a concerted effort on the other side to move beyond what was already in the Book of Discipline, because there's a lot of anti-gay, anti-LGBT stuff in the Book of Discipline already. And then they made a decision to add even more, sort of going after allies and all of this other stuff. And that was like, really, what we have is not enough? You have to go further?
Yeah.
It was a pretty cynical effort to try and drive us one last time, to drive LGBTQ plus people and our allies out of the church. That's what was about.
Before we totally get to 2019, I want to ask a question about 2012. And I wasn't paying attention in the ways that I do now.
Yeah.
But there are some specific moments across general conferences that I remember. And I remember at 2012, I think it was Adam Hamilton who stood at the mic. He might have been with somebody else, but the suggestion was that we are not of one mind in the United Methodist Church around human sexuality. And that, I don't know why for me that felt like an important moment. And I don't know if that fits, again, I'm just coming on the scene. So I've not seen, it could be that there were moments like that at prior general conferences that I just didn't see. But to me, it was like this one moment was like, oh, finally, somebody is speaking some sense about this. But tell me I'm wrong about that, Randall.
No, I don't think you're wrong. So like everything, there was contention around that strategy, but it was Adam was trying to be helpful. So I think he had recently undergone a change in his own perspectives and beliefs, or was undergoing the change, and he thought that if at least we could acknowledge that we were not of one mind and put that in the Book of Discipline. So it was to add on to the incompatibility clause that we are not of one mind, blah, blah, blah. And acknowledge that his belief was that this was a more accurate picture of who we actually are. And it wasn't a theological statement. It was a realist statement about who we actually are. Like right now, the statement that I disagree with is a theological statement about the incompatibility of homosexuality with Christian teachings, but it is a theological statement. And Adam saw it as a kind of strategy, but also just that we should replace that with an acknowledgement that we are not of one mind. There was strong pushback, of course, against that. Right. And it was, I think, correctly perceived by the conservatives. First of all, they just didn't want anything to change, and they didn't want to lose anything. They didn't want to, we built up this wall of discrimination, and we are not going to remove any block of it, no matter what you say. But I think they were right in perceiving that the incompatibility clause is the foundation for all of the other prescriptions against gay and lesbian people in the Book of Discipline. And if you change or remove that, then there is ample ground to challenge why the other things would be there, because you have removed theoretically, you've removed the theological foundation for why you have these discriminatory policies against gay and lesbian people, and now allies. I know he really thought that it would pass. We did not think it would pass, just because of the history of voting and watching the other side. But we weren't winning anything. So it was like, let's try this and see. And for the reasons I just stated, the other side would never have gone for it. It would have been, in their mind, we would have been taking a brick out of the edifice that they had built, and signaling that things were changing, and things were changing. But they, just think of 2012 then, and think about where we are now. And yes, on the one hand, you got the legislation that you always wanted passed in 2019. And you caused the greatest upheaval in the United Methodist Church that has happened since probably the 1950s. And you brought us to the edge of schism, because people, both the way it was done and what was said, people were not prepared to accept that. And so, and the fact that it's like publicized, like, you really heinous behavior, saying heinous things, caught on TV and carried by every major newspaper around the world. So it was just like, you have overshot. And as the conservative, the good news folks would say, what we learned from that is you can impose all the rules that you want, and people will no longer abide by them, including bishops. And so therefore, this edifice that we have been building of more and more exclusionary rules is no longer sufficient, because, large parts of the church have now declared that they're not going to abide by them. And so it's like, so keep building the edifice if you want, but we're not going to listen anymore. And not just the radical affirmation people, but all these other people are just not going to live into it. After 2019, the movement was very shaky, and there was lots of questions about, should we stay in the church? But by and large, we decided that we would stay and fight like hell. And I think that was surprising to the folks on the other side as well. They really did think that they would deliver a knockout punch, where we would leave and go off to the UCC or some other place. And that's not how it happened.
Not at all.
And they were already kind of thinking about, there had been an effort before at schism, and we learned that Good News had a white paper or a draft concept paper about schism for the last 20 years. And so, so we learned a lot, I think. And so it is ironic that we are in this place where at least theoretically, moderates or centrists and progressives are staying, and some reasonable conservatives, and it's the hard right that's going away, which I don't think anybody would have predicted 10 years ago. So
not at all.
We hope you enjoyed the episode. Bar of the Conference is produced by the team at Wesley Survival, a ministry of Studio Wesley. Subscribe to this show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or Google platforms so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.